Today we're going to talk about two other nations that would be strongly influenced by China. Remember that word sinification, to have their cultures blended with that of Chinese culture. We're going to talk about Korea. We're going to talk about Vietnam. Korea and Vietnam, unlike Japan, they actually are going to share borders with the Chinese mainland. Remember, Japan's an island, so there's not as easy contact between Japan and China. So Korea, for example, their proximity to China is going to lead to a far greater influence of Chinese culture onto Korea than that we saw in Japan. However, a separate Korean identity will remain. They don't become completely Sinified. They don't become completely like China. There is going to be an independent culture and political identity that remain. Like Japan, it's going to be Buddhism that is the initial conduit between Chinese life and Korean life. So Buddhist missionaries trying to spread their faith, just like they did in Japan, are going to be taking Chinese culture with them. Under the Han Dynasty, the Korean peninsula was dominated by China. But later, especially during this post-classical period, like during the Tang Dynasty, Korea will be semi-independent. They will essentially become a vassal state of China. Now, we use that word vassal when we talked about Japanese feudalism and when we talked about Western European feudalism. Just remember what a vassal is? Yeah, we said kind of like I oath myself to you. I give you some kind of tribute, all right? I am giving you service and you are providing something from me in return. When we talk about a vassal state, rather than a vassal as like a knight or a samurai, when we talk about a vassal state, we basically are saying that China is strongly influencing Korea. Korea is going to be paying some tribute to China. Like, here's some money. Here, stay away. And in turn for that China, the Tang Dynasty in China, will kind of look out for Korea, or in the same respect, they won't invade and dominate, all right? Because if you stop making your payments, if you stop making your tribute, we talked about this with the Aztec as well, right? If you stop paying what you need to pay, then you might have their armies to deal with. And the Korean armies couldn't keep out or would have a difficult time keeping out the Chinese, so they became a vassal state, or we could also call them a tributary state. All right? They're going to have great influence from China, but like we saw in Japan, the power of Korean aristocratic families will not be diminished. We remember in Confucianist China, the aristocratic, rich landlord families, they were held down by the central government. And in turn, a powerful scholar bureaucracy, a scholar gentry, would arise. And anybody in China could be a part of that scholar gentry. It was primarily rich people, but it could be anybody. In Korea, the powerful aristocratic landowners, that's where rich people are coming from for most of history, the landowners, they're going to maintain their authority. They don't give that up. So just like we said the other day in Japan, the same will be true for Korea. In Korea, in Japan, it is more who you know or who you are rather than what you are or what your abilities are. So powerful aristocratic families will continue to rule Korea. And so Korea doesn't become completely a Chinese-style Confucian bureaucracy. All right? Much of human history, or much of this history that we're talking about, Korea is referred to as the Hermit Kingdom. The Hermit Kingdom. You guys know what a hermit is?
Hermit crab.
Okay, you've seen a hermit crab. All right?
Oh, is there a little guy, hermit, like, kind of nomadic guy?
Okay, yeah, you picture a hermit, when we're talking about a guy that is a hermit, he's like a man without a home. He kind of, maybe he's on his own, off in the wilderness, doing his thing, right? He's got a shack in the woods or something like that. Well, Korea being the Hermit Kingdom, it's a peninsula. It's an offshoot peninsula of Asia here, right? And it's relatively far away. Now, this looks pretty close, but it's relatively far away from the urban centers of China. So it's kind of off on its own and isolated, and that's how they're able to maintain so much of their own autonomy. All right? Vietnam.
That's it from Korea?
Sorry, yes. This is AP World History, man. We fly. Vietnam. Oh, cover your ears, Tyler. The Chinese have long referred to the Vietnamese as southern barbarians. As a people that were foreign, obviously, were different from the Chinese civilization. The Chinese have long called themselves the Middle Kingdom. I think you guys have read of this or heard me say it already. The Chinese have long called themselves the Middle Kingdom. That means that they saw themselves as the center of the universe, and everything else around them was lesser, was subservient, was barbarian. Everything was. And we spend a lot of, I think you guys have probably heard notions of Eurocentrism, like European peoples feeling that they're dominant in the world, because this has been much of the last few hundred years. Well, the Chinese were as ethnocentric as any other peoples of all time. Pretty much every civilization and ethnic group is ethnocentric, right? We do it the best way. The way we do it is the right way to do it. Everything else is weird and different and lesser, all right? So, but the Chinese could probably back it up, because in their world in East Asia, the Chinese did have the most powerful state. The Chinese did have the most powerful military. The Chinese would look down into Vietnam and see no strong centralized state, no strong organized military like they would have. And so they would, of course, call them the same thing or use similar phrases that the Greeks would do to those outsiders, the southern barbarians. They were, like Korea, they were relatively far in Vietnam from the cultural centers of China, but not as far as Japan, remember, because they at least don't have a water border separating them. So Vietnam will develop its own distinctive culture. It's got its own distinctive language. It's got notions of village autonomy, like individual villages kind of run themselves and live their life, and the people within them live their lives the way they see fit. So they're autonomous within Vietnam, even in small villages. Autonomous means to rule yourself.
What sort of time period are we talking about?
We're talking about the classical period and post-classical, early post-classical. So the first millennium. And we're also going to see a stark difference in Vietnam, and this is the one that the AP probably likes to talk about more than anything else. We see a difference in Vietnam compared to China in regards to the status of women. Remember, when we think of China, what is the status of women in China? Definitely lesser. Confucianism and then later Neo-Confucianism reestablishes this idea that this is a starkly patriarchal society, right? Remember the 5 relationships of Confucius. Let's do them. Ruler to ruled. Father to son. Husband to wife. Older brother to younger brother. Friend to friend. So that husband to wife relationship establishes a patriarchal system in China. And then we talked the other day that this was manifested in a Neo-Confucian era with rich aristocratic women eventually trickling down to poorer women, rich aristocratic women doing what to their legs or to their feet? The practice of foot binding. In Vietnam, women have a much more elevated status in Vietnamese culture. This is not to go so far as to say it is a matriarchal society, like where women are dominating men. It's not that, all right? But it is certainly not as patriarchal as we will see up in Vietnam. Women will have more of a voice in Vietnamese culture than they will have in Chinese culture, or in Korean culture, or in Japanese culture. The women, so if you come to your AP exam and you are talking about gender relations through world history or a certain time period, Vietnam is a wonderful example of a place that did it a little bit differently, and women had more of a voice in local rule and in the operations of the household and such. Tyler, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, and also to add on, like, because in that classical period, the first millennia, I should say,
Yeah.
we are about, that's a 1,000 year, we're about 960 years under the Chinese annexation and part of Chinese,
Yeah.
as a district within the Chinese Wei dynasty, Jin dynasty,
Yes.
all those dynasties we're part of. And usually we have a lot of rebellions. And I think out of the 5 main rebellions that caused us to have a brief independence, two of the ones that actually got us independence were actually led by women.
There you
The
go.
Chung sisters and the Trio sisters, they're all women that led the rebellions, riding on elephants to gain independence for 3 years.
So there you go, Gender Equity Club. Now you guys got to go talk about Vietnamese women in the first millennium riding on elephants rebelling against the Chinese. It sounds like a great story. All right. So politically speaking, Vietnam is going to, for much of the first millennium, as Tyler just mentioned, it's going to be, at least in part, dominated by China. In the 220s, as early as the 220s BCE, the Qin dynasty will make raids into northern Vietnam, into what is today northern Vietnam. Qin, Q-I-N. In 220 BCE, they will be raiding northern Vietnam. The next Chinese dynasty after the Qin is the Han dynasty, will ultimately come to dominate northern Vietnam, and they will secure tribute from them, just like we talked about Korea paying tribute to China. Secure tribute and later outright conquer much of Vietnam. This is where most of the Chinese influence into Vietnamese culture comes. But again, as Tyler just mentioned, over time, revolts, because, these Chinese are trying to bring in a new way of life and a new order to the Vietnamese. Constant revolts and resistance of Chinese culture would keep Vietnam from being completely absorbed into the Chinese world. By the year 939, Vietnam would gain its independence. And this is a story that we want to remember going forward. You're going to read in your Genghis Khan book, you're going to read in chapter 14, I believe, about attempts from the Mongol armies in China when China becomes the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols trying to get into Vietnam, and the Vietnamese holding them off. And later, the French are obviously going to be in Vietnam, and there's going to be resistance of Vietnamese people to keep the French out. And then, obviously, the United States, we started the day talking about the United States, are going to be involved in Vietnam, and there's going to be tremendous resistance from much of Vietnam to drive the Americans out. So we've got a 2,000-plus year history of Vietnamese striving for political independence, which they today have.
What was the year we became independent?
939. So yes, sir.
Just to make a quick point, the 939, that year we gained independence is primarily due to the fact that when the Tang dynasty fell,
Yep.
they divided to so many smaller regions, like kingdoms and such.
Yeah.
So that kingdom that had governed Vietnam is very small, and then using that chance, we just snatch our way out.
And it makes absolute sense.
Also, Vietnam on that map is not Vietnam in classical period. Vietnam in classical period, it's just a tiny northern part of it. It didn't include any of the south.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I just plugged a Wikipedia map there. All right. So, in summation, Sinification of Japan and Korea in Vietnam. They will all adopt some elements of Chinese culture. Writing styles. Some levels of bureaucratic organization. Obviously, maybe the most important cultural idea coming from China to all of them is Buddhism. Art. You can look at Chinese art and Vietnamese art and Korean art and Japanese art and see a lot of similarities there. So we've got a lot of cultural sharing. If we need to rank these, we would see that, thank you so much, we would see Korea being the most heavily influenced and becoming the most like China. then probably Vietnam, and then probably Japan. But all of these places, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, they will have very little contact with the wider world outside of China, for example. Remember, China's got a lot of contact with other parts of the world via Silk Road trade. We're going to talk more about that next week. But Vietnam and Korea and Japan, relatively isolated, especially when compared to a place like China.